Hi students, it's Mr. Alberhaski here. I'm here today to talk to you about Mise. For the life of me, I can't get Professor Pontificate to return my phone calls lately, so you're just going to be stuck with me. I guess I'm not sure what's going on. I know he can be a bit of a prick sometimes, but you know, his theory's pretty good, so we'll do the best we can. So the subject of today's lecture is mise en scène. Mise en scène is a French term which essentially means everything arranged in the shot. Now, the reason we use that term is one, so we can impress our friends, but secondly, because historically speaking, the French were some of the first to write about film as art, and so the term that they came up with is the one that kind of is stuck. So most textbooks are going to use the term mise en scène when we're talking about the analyzing the visual arrangement of things that we see in the frame. And so, you know, the way I think of it is if you were to pause a film and analyze that image that you see up on the screen, what you're doing is analyzing the mise en scène. So looking at the characters, the setting, the props, everything that you see. Now we can break mise en scène down into four different components. We have the setting, actors, lighting, and the composition. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of these. Now, the two different styles of mise en scène derive from two different film movements. One is German Expressionism, which was a particular movement that originated, you guessed it, in Germany in the 1920s, up till the rise of Hitler. Essentially, Nazism and Hitler destroyed the German film industry in the 1930s. But Expressionism was a very flourishing movement, considered the golden age of the German cinema. And it is a distinct style of mise en scène that creates sort of a grotesque, kind of warped, distorted view of the world. And typically those German expressionistic films tend to relate back to a character who views the world that way. So most of the time they were derivative of a certain type of storyteller. The other style is French poetic realism, which is a movement in the late 1920s through the 1930s, which tended more towards realistic depictions of settings, but of course you have poetic license. And so it's not as if we're taking the camera out into reality to find actual images and objects, people and settings and so forth, but we have a tendency towards greater verisimilitude, but yet with a poetic license to kind of rearrange and capture things. Which isn't to say that, you know, though we've tended towards the French poetic realism as the preferred type of mise en scène, that we've completely abandoned German Expressionism, because it's still used to some degree in genres like the horror genre or the film noir, and it's also used in certain instances in narrative films like dream sequences will borrow heavily from German Expressionism, or maybe you know, a scene where a character takes some drugs and has a hallucinogenic experience. That might derive more from the expressionistic tradition. Now, the mise en scène is foundational to any viewer's experience of the film. It's what we see on the actual screen, and it's what helps us construct the fabula. Remember from Professor Pontificate's lecture on the distinction between the plot and the fabula. The plot is the images we see on the screen, the action as it unfolds, and then the fabula is what the viewer does to recreate the story world. Mise en scène also creates motifs, which are repetitions of things, could be objects, colors, etc. And mise en scène also reinforces themes and helps establish a mood or tone to the film. Now, these images are from the German expressionistic film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was the first German Expressionism film made in 1919. And we see in these images a very distorted, a very warped, grotesque world. And again, it does relate back to the way the character views the world, the point of view of the main character in the film. The setting. The setting is the time and the place, so it does establish time and place, but more significantly, it also introduces characters. We get to see how characters interact with their setting. It also helps to establish a theme and create mood or atmosphere in the film as well. Now, films can be shot either in the studio or on location. On location means that the filmmakers take their cameras and go out into the world. But of course they might be filming in a different location than the story is set in. So, though they might be filming in Iowa, the story is set in Wyoming or vice versa. So just because you're on location doesn't mean that you're shooting where the film is set. Now, force perspective can be accomplished either in the studio or on location. That's when the filmmakers rearrange buildings or objects on the set or in the field because they want to achieve a certain aesthetic effect. CGI, computer-generated imagery, can help enhance the setting and sometimes entirely create settings. We can also expand our idea of setting to include thinking about what types of spaces we find ourselves in. Are we indoors? Are we outdoors? Are we in domestic spaces, in workspaces, in public spaces? Are we in restaurants? Are we in spacious locations or cramped locations? Are they sunny and bright? Are they dark and shadowy? And we could go on and on of describing ways in which we can talk about the setting that we find ourselves in. Also, it's important to note that certain genres are very intimately linked with setting. So if you think about the Western, the film is going to be set in the American Southwest during the time of westward expansion. The gangster film is going to be set in an urban environment, typically a large city, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. The horror film is not necessarily so much a city, but you're going to find dimly lit spaces, right? Claustrophobic spaces. If you're in a house, you might find yourself in the basement or a creepy attic. The romantic comedy, by contrast, is going to be find yourself in lots of sunny, brightly lit spaces. Maybe walk along the beach, in the park. So naturalistic settings typically occupy many of the spaces in romantic comedies. All right, so we have the setting. The second part of the mise en scène is the actors. Now, the actors are the most prominent component of narrative filmmaking. Typically, they'll comprise most of the shots and be the focal point of most of the shots in narrative films. When we're talking about actors in relation to the mise en scène, usually we're talking about how they're arranged within the frame. So that refers to blocking, how actors are arranged and how they move around within the frame in the screen space. We can also think about actors in terms of different styles of acting. So I'll talk briefly about typecasting, character actors, impersonators, personality actors, and method actors. Now the method actors, perhaps one of the first screen method actors was Marlon Brando, but it's a certain style of acting where the actor really becomes the character. So they really get to know the character inside out, and they in essence become this character. Daniel Day-Lewis is a more modern example. In his film There Will Be Blood a couple years back, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He kind of becomes this rich oil tycoon, this very ruthless character who's got this sort of limp and drawl and talks a certain way and is very, very ruthless. And Lewis really becomes this character. When the director yells cut, all the other actors kind of go back to being themselves, but Lewis stays in character. He stays in character when he goes home, and he said in an interview I watched with him that it took him months after the film was over for him to completely come out of this character. He was so deeply immersed in it that he had become this character for the entire duration of the production of this film. It took a toll on him personally as well as on his family life, etc. Robert De Niro's early work is another good example of method acting. You think of Taxi Driver or Raging Bull. In Raging Bull, he plays Jake LaMotte, a boxer who kind of spans his career. At the beginning, he's this very lean, fit boxer, and De Niro's very much in shape. By the end of the film, he had gained a considerable amount of weight, and as opposed to using cosmetics and costume and special effects, De Niro actually gained something like 50 pounds to portray this character. And so that's something a method actor would do, right? Kind of becomes this character, and it can take a great toll on them physically and mentally. By contrast, impersonators can disappear into their role, but when the director yells cut, they go back to being themselves, and they also become good friends with their costumers and their makeup artist, and kind of let them do the magic as opposed to letting their body undergo the toil of maybe gaining or losing weight, fluctuating to become characters. So actors like Meryl Streep, Sean Penn, the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, they are people who have an ability to portray a wide range of characters and do so very well, such that I will be watching one of their films and kind of forget that I'm watching Meryl Streep, right? Because she does such a phenomenal job of becoming these characters. But what makes her different than the method is the way in which they approach it, right? They don't really become them in the psychological way that the method actors do. So some actors sometimes sarcastically call this acting, as opposed to whatever it is those method actors do, which might be more akin to madness. Now, personality actors play essentially themselves, so they play loosely defined roles or personas that are based on their real personalities. Woody Allen would be a great example of that. Sort of the New York, sex-obsessed Jewish person, and he plays that same role over and over in all of his films. Character actors play the same roles, so character actors are similar to typecasting. So typecasting refers to kind of A-list actors, the lead actors who get stuck in the same role, and essentially they play the same role over and over again. How that's different than personality actors is it's not related to their personality per se. Personality actors are playing kind of loose versions of themselves. Typecast means they're just sort of stuck in the same role. And then character actors are also stuck in the same role, but character actors are supporting roles, whereas typecast are the lead roles. The wider range of personalities that Meryl Streep has played kind of disappears into very well. Woody Allen, believe it or not, all these images are taken from different films of his, but essentially just playing the same character over and over again. Very loose version of himself, kind of the neurotic Jewish New York, upper middle class, etc. Ensemble acting involves a large cast rather than a couple leads. Modern examples might be the film Crash or Cloud Atlas, where there's not like one main protagonist, but just a variety of different actors that have smaller parts. Now, conventional acting involves character identification, so the viewer relates to the character. So if the character is feeling sad or happy, romantic, terrified, whatever it might be, that emotion is then passed on to the viewer so that an identification forms. By contrast, Brechtian estrangement means that there's a distance between the character and the viewer. So the viewer doesn't always know what the character is doing. They might be distanced from them because they lack insight, or they might just not feel that sort of sympathy that you do in conventional acting. And it's a particular strand. Brechtian estrangement refers to the playwright Brecht, who is also a film screenwriter as well. And you don't see this in conventional Hollywood, so it's more of a function of something that exists in the art cinema tradition. And Brecht was trying to achieve a more cognitive approach to film where you can think about and intellectually kind of analyze the circumstances of a character and think about them more on an intellectual basis, rather than with conventional acting and character identification is more an emotional experience. So Brecht was going for something more intellectual than emotional. All right, lighting. So we've talked about setting, we've talked about the actors, and the third component of the mise en scène is the lighting. And lighting helps further the audience's understanding of character. It, of course, illuminates the action, and it can develop theme and establish mood and atmosphere as well. The three attributes of lighting include the quality of the light, which could be hard or soft, the placement of the light, which is the direction from which it strikes the subject, and then the contrast, which can range from high to low. Now, hard light is produced by a small light source positioned close to the subject and can create deep shadows and emphasize imperfections. So certainly actresses do not typically want to be shot in hard light. It's typically reserved for something more like the rugged cowboy, your John Wayne or your Marlboro Man, who is going for that kind of hard-working, gruff features. So hard light would work well for them. By contrast, soft light is produced from a larger source that's more diffuse, and as a result it minimizes imperfections. So typically actresses like to be shot in soft light. I once had a student, we were watching a series of films from the 30s and 40s, and she said, why do all the actresses from this era glow? And I said, well, it's not that the actresses glowed so much as that it's the cinematographers were using soft light. It kind of creates this kind of soft, beautiful, glowing types of images. Now, natural light is obviously the sun. That's our natural source. And the sun can give hard or soft light depending on the time of day, the time of year, the cloud cover, etc. Cinematographers often like to work in the magic hour that occurs just before sunrise or after sunset, when the sun is low on the horizon or just below the horizon. It kind of creates a nice, warm, glowing images. Light can be directed from a variety of ways. We have frontal, side, and rear. In the frontal, the light source is in the front. Obviously, the subject hits the subject from the front and casts shadows behind. The side, the light source strikes the subject from the side and creates kind of a sculptured three-dimensional effect. And then rear light strikes the subject from behind. It can separate the subject from the background and to help eliminate shadows as well. Now, in the studio era, by the 1930s, Hollywood had developed what's called a three-point lighting system. And it developed throughout the 1930s, and it remains standard to today. So the three basic points of the system are the primary source, the fill light, and the backlight. The primary source is called the key. This is the key light, and it's light that strikes the subject from a frontal position. It could be positioned anywhere next to the camera up to about a 45-degree angle between the camera and the subject. I've got a little diagram on the next slide that'll show what this looks like. The second source of light is the fill light, and this is set opposite of the key, and it helps to eliminate some of the shadow that's cast by the key light. The backlight is aimed at the subject either from behind or from above, or a combination of both, and it also helps to fill in some of the shadow that's cast by the key or the fill, and it helps separate the subject from the background. So we see in this diagram, you have the subject in the center, the camera in the front, the key light is screen left, the fill light's on the opposite screen right, and then the backlight obviously set behind the subject. And so the filmmakers can help adjust all of the different intensities on these lights to create the desired amount of light and shadow within the screen. Other types of lights, OB lights, are eye lights. You may have noticed that occasionally an actor's eyes might gleam, or the light might catch in the actor's eyes to produce sort of an aesthetic effect, and that's called OB lights, so named for the actress Merle Oberon from the 1930s. High key lighting is when the certain fill to key ratio is achieved that creates very little shadow. So what you mostly see up on the screen is light. And high key lighting is also known as low contrast lighting. So it's sort of counterintuitive that you have high key but low contrast. What that means is that there's low contrast, there's little difference between light and shadow, which is what high key does, is it creates mostly light. The natural key lighting, of course, is used when we have on location shooting and the sun is our natural. And that can have a good variance between high and low. Now, low key lighting, on the other hand, is when you have a key to fill ratio at somewhere between 16:1 to 32:1. But essentially what that means is that we have mostly shadow on the screen. So it creates a high contrast. There's areas of dark, there's areas of light, but we see a lot of that shadow in the screen space. A few images. This is side lighting. We see the light striking the subject from the left, creates sort of a sculptured look, and we see shadow on the opposite side. OB lights. This is an image of Merle Oberon, the actress, for whom the lights are named. High key lighting tends to be associated with certain genres like the musical, the romantic comedies, things that are brightly lit and tend to give a happy feel. By contrast, low key lighting used oftentimes in the horror film, in the mystery, in the film noir, and so we see in the screen space lots of shadow. The image on the right, we see the Venetian blinds create sort of a latticed effect across the subject, creating those striking images of light and shadow. And of course, filmmakers could use color lighting for a variety of reasons. All right, composition. So the fourth element of the mise en scène is a composition. We have the setting, the actors, the lighting, and then the composition. And the composition refers to the visual arrangements of the objects, the actors, and the space within the frame. Now, if we think about taking the film frame and drawing lines horizontally and vertically through the center, we come up with 4 different quadrants. And balanced composition is achieved when the filmmakers have centered the subject within that so that there's equitable portions of light and dark, colors, and figures in all 4 of those quadrants. Now, in classical Hollywood filmmaking, symmetry or balanced composition was generally the rule that was attempted to be achieved, and that was generally done by centering the actors in the shot. So if you center the actor right in the middle of the frame, that kind of achieves a nice balanced composition. By contrast, asymmetrical composition is off balance. So if the subject is on the screen left and that leaves a lot of open space on screen right, then what you have there is asymmetrical framing. Loose framing, the figures have a good deal of space around them, and so that there's areas where there's open space and there's other areas where the figure is. Versus tight framing means that there's very little space around the subjects. The focus can be shallow or in depth. Shallow focus means that images in the foreground are in focus, but things in the background are out of focus, whereas in depth means that everything in that frame is in focus, both foreground and background. Now, rack focus is a technique that's accomplished, and technically it's under the heading of cinematography, but it kind of fits in with our ideas here, where we have, let's say, a figure in the foreground who's in focus and a character in the background who's out of focus, and suddenly that focal point shifts so that the figure in the foreground is no longer in focus, but the figure in the background is. That's called rack focus, and it could go either way, and it might move back and forth within the same shot. And that is accomplished through a special lens. In classical filmmaking, the goal of every shot is to direct the audience's attention to the object of greatest significance. That would relate to the narrative, and again help our viewer construct the fabula. To keep the image in constant motion, and also to create an illusion of depth, because of course the screen that the viewer is watching the film on is in 2-dimensional space, but the space that the camera is filming is 3-dimensional. And so the filmmakers need to use a variety of tricks to capture that 3-dimensional space. The way they can do that is by varying the size of objects within the frame, by using both the foreground and the background, by varying the sharpness of the focus, by the movement of the subject, having actors walk around within the frame, by varying the arrangement of people and objects, by the lighting, and also by the color. Now, fixed frame movement keeps the image in motion, so the camera remains in one position, but the subject is going to move around. And the subject could move left to right, could move in depth, that's called lateral, is left to right. In depth means that the subject moves forward or away from the camera, and diagonal is a combination of both lateral and in depth. And filmmakers like to use a variety of different types of movement. If you simply use left to right movement, that kind of creates a sense that of 2-dimensional space. So filmmakers need to use the in-depth and the diagonal to showcase that 3-dimensional space. There's an image from Citizen Kane, very iconic image where we have deep focus, we have characters in the foreground, the midground, the background. There's sort of interesting things going on all of the layers of the screen space. There's an example of shallow focus. We see a character on the left who's in focus, and then on the right the image is very blurry. We don't see the background at all. Example of loose framing, we have the characters down towards the bottom left of the screen space, slightly asymmetrically framed within it. And there's a lot of space around them. We see mountains in the background, a brick wall of a building in the foreground right. This is an example of tight framing. The characters are framed very tightly in the screen space. There's not a lot of room or space around them. And then color. I'll talk a little bit about color. Color is something that obviously brings us visual pleasure. It's certainly one aspect of spectacle within the film world. Color dates all the way back to the silent era. Many people think of color being more modern, old films being in black and white. That's not the case. The technology has always sort of been around, and there were ways of inserting color into silent films. Two ways they did that was through tinting or toning. So one way is the filmmakers would actually hand paint each film still to get color on there, a very laborious process. The other way was by taking the film stock and immersing it in dye, and so that kind of gave the entire film a certain tone or color. But Technicolor has been around since the 1920s. By 1929 there was over 20 companies that had color patents, but ultimately Technicolor won a monopoly in Hollywood, in large part because they were willing to finance the production of many Hollywood films. Technicolor lost money for many, many years before it was able to finally iron out some of the difficulties. It was a very expensive technology. Hollywood could have converted to color in the late 1920s when they converted to sound, but they didn't, simply for financial reasons. It wasn't cost efficient. And so the color technology was there. There are some color films from that era, but they simply was no financial incentive for Hollywood to convert to color in the 1930s or 40s. By the 40s there were more Technicolor productions. 20th Century Fox kind of led the way with the most Technicolor films in the 40s. And they were associated with certain genres. Musicals tended to be in color, historical epics, action-adventure films, whereas the horror films, film noirs, science fiction films tended to be in black and white. Now the conversion in Hollywood finally came in the 1950s, and really it was a result of competition from television. So at that point in time television was in black and white, and so the filmmakers switched to color as an incentive, trying to draw viewers away from their home living rooms and their television sets into the theaters. But of course the history of color in Hollywood has been one that says that color should be in the service of narrative. So color should help enhance and tell the story. It should serve verisimilitude to create a semblance of reality. And so color doesn't exist for its own sake, but it's something that's used to help better tell the story. Other effects or uses of color, of course, it attracts our attention. It creates a sense of three-dimensional space because certain colors recede and others advance, and so that creates that sense of three-dimensionality. Color creates mood. Another clever use of color is it can be used as a motif, so it could be associated with a particular character or a theme, in that sense that color accrues meaning by the end of the film. Color could also be used as a transitional device. Think of the film The Wizard of Oz, that starts in black and white when we're set in Kansas and then moves to color when we get to Oz. And of course that's an excellent example, but there are other subtler examples. Color could be used expressionistically to relate to a character. Something a character feels internally is shown to be external to that character. That's expressionism. Color could be used symbolically as well as ironically. Ironically means that you find a color means something the opposite of what you would anticipate it means. So we typically think of red as a passionate color, but if that somehow gets associated with something that lacks passion, then that would be an ironic use of color. Alright, that ends our lecture on mise en scène. Until next time, we'll catch you later.